Good morning, everyone. Good to see your smiling faces this morning. Hope you're excited about our conversation today. I want to give a special welcome to those of you who may be new to All Saints Church. Welcome to our Sunday experience. Hope that you all enjoyed our 9 a.m. service, and if you have not worshiped with us yet, we have another service immediately following this Rector's Forum at 11:15. If you would like to be kept apprised of future events of interest here at All Saints Church, there are green contact sheets near both doors, so please be sure to fill those out and give us your contact information so we can stay in touch with you. Also, I want to let you know that the restrooms are just outside the glass door here as I'm pointing to my left, and so feel free to use those at any point should you need. Also, the emergency exits. Yeah, this is the perfect time to go. There are emergency exits at all four corners of this room should we find ourselves in an emergency. And also know, again, that if you are new here at All Saints Church, there's a welcome table on the lawn where you can pick up a red welcome bag. It includes lots of information about what's happening here at All Saints, including a welcome card that you can take with you and fill out so that, again, we get your contact information and can stay in touch with you. I want to let you know what today's action is. This Sunday, as every Sunday we put our faith into action, this week we are going to be opposing the proposed rule change within the Department of Health and Human Services that seeks to remove transgender people from Title IX protections by basically trying to define transgender people out of existence. So please make your way to the action table. We have one over here. I'm sure our volunteer will be here momentarily to set that up. There's also a table on the lawn. Please add your signature to that letter. Also, it is still possible to make a contribution at the sign-up center to the organization Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society on behalf of the Tree of Life Synagogue. This is our attempt to show solidarity with that community that was targeted for the work that they do, the excellent work that they do with refugees. And so please, if you are inclined to feeling generous today, you can make a donation to that organization at the sign-up center. And I want to remind you that it's thanks to your generosity that this institution is what it is. Please consider making a pledge to All Saints Church so that we can continue to spread justice and healing in the community, in the nation, and in the world. So today's Rector's Forum, I'm so delighted to be able to do it. Mike is away, and he asked for me to step in, and I thought, well, this will be really easy because we're going to have Zach Hoover come and talk about the midterm elections. And Zach is a friend of mine, and so my approach in asking Zach to do this with me was, let's just pretend it's one of those nights where we're out for a pint and a slice of pizza, and we're having a conversation, except there'll be maybe 120 or 40 people in the room with us. So
we'll have coffee instead of beer.
We have coffee instead of pints, and so we'll make it work. It's a little bit earlier than usual, but I'm delighted to introduce you to Zach Hoover. Some of you may know him. He is the executive director of LA Voice and is in his 13th year with Faith in Action, which was formerly known as the PICO National Network. He holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard and is ordained in the American Baptist Church. Zach first learned organizing from Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico. Since joining LA Voice, he has led organizing campaigns that have dismantled unfair car impound policies targeting immigrants, increased access to groceries and food deserts, increased public accountability for reinvestment by major financial institutions, increased voter participation in communities of color, removed obstacles to employment for formerly incarcerated Angelenos, and bridged gaps between communities divided by race, class, and geography. Please join me in welcoming Zach Hoover. So I do want to point out that All Saints Church has worked closely with LA Voice over the years, and one of the most recent major campaigns that we worked with LA Voice on was Prop 47. We did a lot of organizing work here in our community, and thanks to your organizers, phone banked, signed petitions, you named it, so that we could be part of that effort. that really change the lives of nonviolent offenders in our communities. We also recently worked with one of your organizers whose position has changed since, but I had a great experience working with Lisa Lockwood on a mayoral candidate forum here in Pasadena when we were up for our mayoral elections. And LA Voice organized us, along with other faith institutions here in Pasadena, to create a very specific candidate forum that focused on issues that matter most to the faith community. And we asked some pretty pointed questions of our mayoral candidates in that context, and it was a very successful experience. And then I've also lobbied with you and some of your staff and colleagues up and down the state of California, up in Sacramento, for particular issues, and it's been always a joy to work with LA Voice. But I would love, Zach, if you could take this opportunity to share with those in the room more specifically about what LA Voice's mission is and what it is that you do in our communities.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm really excited to be here, both with my friend and also with new friends, which is exciting. I just normally am at this hour just starting worship down the street at First Baptist Church of Pasadena, so I'll bring you neighborly greetings from there, and I'll be joining them later on after we finish up. So I'm really excited to be neighbors, and actually our pastor and your new rector have become friends, and they're part of a little group that gets together and supports each other, so that also gives me joy. So LA Voice is a multiracial interfaith organization. We work with 55 churches, synagogues, and mosques across LA County, and were originally founded as two different organizations. One, a Hollywood interfaith organization that was founded in part by Father Michael Mandala, who, may he rest in peace, just passed away of cancer about a month ago. And also Community Voice, which was a South LA and East Side organization. Our mission is, like your mission here, is not ambitious at all. It's to turn LA County into a place where there's actually racial equity and abundant life for all of her residents. And we do that in a couple different ways. So the organization it's both a vehicle for power and policy change. So that's, a big part of it is you've named campaigns that we've worked on together, trying to shape the policy landscape so that it's more fair, so that it's better for our communities in particular that we work with. And that involves all the things that might be implied in some of the things you just shared, which is training people in how do I actually bring our congregation's voice or our community's voice more effectively and more powerfully into the public debate about who gets what and how much. And the other thing that the organization is it's actually also a community in formation. So it's not just a mechanism for changing policy, but it's also a place where, one of the things that people often say after they come away from their first LA Voice meeting is, I've not been in a room like that either ever or in a long time. And what they mean by that is, if you would ask people in different parts of our organization, like Daria Nunez, who's on our board and lives in Pico Gardens and goes to Dolores Mission Church, she would say that she never met not only a rabbi, but never knew a Jew before she was involved with LA Voice. Some of our folks on the west side in some of our synagogues would say, I had never met an African-American Muslim in any way other than just in passing before I was part of LA Voice. Some people would say, well, yeah, I have a lot of incarceration stories in my family, but I don't have any deportation stories in my family. So another really important part of the organization for us, and honestly, I think the thing that is in many ways most life-giving is that it's a place where people connect and get to see each other in a way that is outside of the ways we're taught to see each other. So that means we talk about race. That means we talk about who makes how much money and how much they have and why. That means we talk about how it is that our neighborhoods came to be separate from each other. And it means sometimes that it's really hard work. So so that's kind of the gist. And you want me to share about the issue areas? So the three main issue areas that we focus on are, and this all shifted about 6 years ago. We kind of went through a process of trying to hone our vision and say no to some things, which if you're like me is not easy to do. And sometimes it's really hard for organizations and institutions to do, but we felt like we were spreading ourselves too thin. So we went through a process with grassroots leaders and clergy and board members and asked ourselves, what feels like are the big systems that if we move those, they're going to have the biggest impact and also that are closest to our people's hearts. So we had a bunch of stuff on the table that we'd either been working on or had worked on historically, and where we landed was criminal justice reform, which includes policing as well as reentry, the front end and the back end. Immigrant integration, which for us, that phrase means that every immigrant is seen as fully a citizen of this county and of this state and of this country, and treated as such. And then the third is affordable housing and homelessness, which is a historic issue for us, and obviously has become much more difficult and even harder, and I know we're going to talk about some more. And then one last key strategy that I'll share that has become a really important part of what we do is, on our website we call it Voice for All. But we have a strategy called 100% voting congregations. A lot of folks think that their congregations are voting because that's the story that they tell themselves. But one of our congregations, when they first gave us their membership list to match against the voter file, which is public information, they were really surprised to learn that instead of like 90% of their people were voting in every election, it was more like 65%. And they had been telling themselves, like, oh, we vote, like, we need to go to other communities and help them vote. And this was a whiter community, and it was like, no, actually, let's, like, work on your house, and let's partner with others at the same time. So that's a big part of our work, and in this last election cycle, volunteers had 8,145 or something conversations with voters, mostly directly through our communities, from our communities and congregations. And then we had also a paid phone bank team of formerly incarcerated folks that talked to about 20,000 voters, not counting the C4 stuff.
So this 100% voting congregation strategy is really interesting to me because I think you're right. I think so many communities are focused on this notion of get out the vote and going out and meeting people out in the streets and going into communities which are underserved and getting those voters registered to vote, those potential voters registered to vote. But there's really work that we have to do internally, right? It's kind of, for me, what intrigued me, and I remember my first conversation with Lisa about this, it's around like getting our own house clean before we go out and do any work outside. So, and I also remember she shared some data with me, demographics of a particular congregation, which will go nameless, and yeah, that comparison between the church membership and the voting roster and who had voted in the last general election, who votes on the regular and midterms, and it's startling, that data. I mean, I posted something recently, I don't know if you caught this, Zach. There's an app now that does this based on your contacts in your phone. So you could go through your phone contacts and find out how people have voted because it's all public record. Not how they voted in terms of candidates, but I know, some of you all, let me tell you, you're in my phone and I know exactly what you've done and haven't done. So, I mean, it's a fascinating thing, but what I think is really powerful is the acknowledgement, much like this app, the power that congregations have is to say that a team of volunteers could make a call and say, Christina, I want to make sure are you registered to vote? Even though you might have some of the information already. Do you need a ride to the next election? Is there anything I can do to help facilitate? Do you need some information about the ballot measures? And that as a volunteer within the congregation, that personal touch can make a huge, huge difference. Can you share a little bit more about that? I mean, like mobilizing communities around getting 100% voting congregations.
Yeah, I think, one of the things, just thinking about the list for a second, is it actually just gives you a target to work with, which is super helpful. I mean, if you're trying to accomplish something and you don't know where the finish line is or like how far away it is, that's hard. But the other point of it is to move it out of just, okay, we have 3 weeks left in the election, let's all do voter stuff, and move it into an ongoing conversation inside the life of the community about, and just tie it to the questions about power, who has it and how much and why. So that's part of it, is to integrate it more into the life of the congregation. And I should also say it's not just 100% voting for all who are eligible, it's also 100% citizenship. So in some of our congregations we have maybe 100 people who could naturalize and become citizens, and they haven't. So that's part of the work as well. It's like, can we get everybody to their maximal civic power inside of this particular community, and what difference that might make? I mean, you guys you're looking at the election results and seeing how close some of these races are. I used to organize in Coachella Valley. My friend Maggie Downs, who still lives and works out there with her family, she said there's a 1 vote difference in a race for city council in Indio. Wow. And the total vote is only like 1,600 people. So we work with 55 dues-paying member and partner congregations, and there's kind of a difference in the designation, but basically they're all partners or members of LA Voice. which have about 50,000 families as in their membership. Imagine if every voter in those 50,000 families was showing up, was voting in a similar way around similar values that we were all identifying together. I guarantee our conversation with Alex Villanueva, or did we hear who won that, by the way?
Still don't know.
So I think maybe not a final count,
the sheriff's race, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just so different. It's so different. Even the small amount of voting work we've done over the last few years for our congregations has changed their relationships with local elected officials, with statewide elected officials. But yeah, it's all about the individual. I mean, if you call me and you ask me about voting something, it's so different than the random person dialing me from the predictive dialer from North Carolina, who I'm going to talk to her anyway because I know how hard it is to be a phone banker.
Yes.
But a lot of you aren't.
But you might be an outlier.
Yeah. So I just think we have these resources all around us that are ourselves, and we're not fully utilizing them because there's all these guides about, well, this is how you have to do voter work. And if you're not doing it, then you're not really doing it the right way. Well, that's not true. Communities have been doing effective voter work just by talking to each other for as long as there's been voter work.
And I appreciate you talking about the fact that that's ongoing work, right? That it's not just about any one election. Though I will say, I think all of us were mindful about these midterms as soon as the new administration took place, right? That we were preparing for this moment. So I know LA Voice had been preparing for this moment, as have been a number of organizations. And I'm even remembering a conversation that I had with a political director with a labor union not too long ago. We were talking about some local issues for which we would like labor to support us on, and he said, I'm thinking about 2020. Right? So that there are some organizations and some leadership that obviously we're focused on the midterms, but are actually even thinking even beyond in 2020. But I know LA Voice was really active in these midterm elections, and so I'm curious to hear from you, Zach, what for you was the biggest surprise in this midterm election? And maybe if you could also share maybe what didn't surprise you at all in this midterm election.
Yes, and I want to hear your answer to this as well. So I don't know how surprised I am by outcomes of any election these days. Once we got through 2016, where I really was surprised, I think one thing that surprised me a little bit, which was less about candidates, was how after Amendment 4 in Florida, how many of you are familiar with that? Raise your hand. So it's basically re-enfranchises people with felony convictions in Florida with voting rights. So it passed this year. And it actually passed really handily. And it didn't surprise me that it passed because our network was working on it. Faith in Florida was working on it. But they failed to qualify for the ballot just a couple of years ago. They couldn't even get the signatures to get it on the ballot. So and then that was, I guess, 4 years ago. And then once they got it on the ballot once before and did not win. So I think it's like this long game thing that you're describing right now around the integrating of voter work throughout, year after year. In some ways, I was just surprised that it was almost like it was a week out and they were like, oh yeah, we're going to win. And I was like, man, that's awesome. So that was a surprise. I was not surprised that, we didn't take the Senate. I think that to me was, some people seem surprised by that. I'm not surprised by it, and it also is not bumming me out, and I'm not going around talking about, oh man, we really screwed up, we didn't get the Senate. I don't think that's helpful. And I'll be interested to see what happens with the sheriff's race. So I was not particularly surprised that Villanueva was as competitive as he was and maybe our next sheriff, but I think a lot of people were. A lot of people thought, oh, no way, it's going to be McDonald's race and he's gonna stay in because that's kind of the way it's been. So I guess I'm saying I wasn't surprised by much. Maybe that we won the Katie Hill one longer and then 4, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the night before the election, I had a friend ask me, are you optimistic? And I said, I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic. So I was grateful that we were able to change the House of Representatives. I think that's something to celebrate, because I think that, especially now that it's more women and more women of color, I think tremendous things can happen on the social justice front.
Can we just clap for 100 women in Congress for the first time ever? And 2 Muslims?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So women and persons of color now dominate the House of Representatives, and white men dominate the Senate. So that's our reality, which is both surprising and not surprising. I immediately go to what has been released as the cover of the next edition of The New Yorker. If you've seen it, some people have seen it already. It's fantastic, where it's a sort of a black and white sketch drawing of what appear to be white men, and the door is opening, and then what is in color are a variety of women making their way through the door. So I think that makes me really excited, and was, in that spirit of hopeful. I have a lot of hope in the change that's possible with that change, and I think that surprised me. I will say that, so the day of the election, I was a poll worker. I volunteered again as a clerk. And so there were some surprises for me in terms of like our democracy in action, how the voting system works. And I will say that there were so many people who came in prepared to vote. And that really excited me. Their sample ballots were filled out. They knew exactly what they were there to do, and did it, and then were in and out and excited. And everyone was in a good mood this election. When I worked the presidential election in 2016, I encountered a lot of nasty people, which was really interesting. A lot of ill-tempered people. But everyone was in really great spirits, and there were a lot of prepared voters. There were even some folks who came in and said, listen, this isn't my polling place. I'm not on your roster, but I can't get to my polling location in time, and it's really important to me today that I vote, so I know I can only vote provisionally, but I want to do that. I facilitated that for about 10 people. That felt significant to me. That really surprised me and excited me, that people knew their rights well enough to come in and ask for that specifically. And I think we can applaud that. I think it's an indication, right, in terms of this movement. Midterms are generally really low in participation. I think we tend to average about 40% of registered voters vote during midterms, and I think the projection is that maybe we reached about 48% for this midterm, which I think is something to celebrate. So that surprised me, and and excites me at the same time. I think there's a lot of possibility there.
I just want to add to this about the provisional ballots. So we're lucky to be in a state, and it's not luck, it's people have worked hard to make it this way, where we're consistently making it easier for people to vote. And I had the same experience of, we were on the phones all day. We had election day hubs at, I think, 5 or 6 different congregations, and I was at Dolores Mission. And I talked to 3 different young adults, all younger than me, one of whom who had never voted before, confessed. She called me back. I had called her cell phone. She called me back about an hour later, and she was like, I just feel stupid. She's like, I don't know what to do. I've never voted before. I'm embarrassed that I haven't voted before. I don't understand these ballot measures. So, it kind of goes back to this personal contact thing. I had never met her before, but she was clearly hungry to participate. Like, it wasn't about something magical that I did other than being there and being available. And we talked her through a couple of the ballot measures, like 10 and 5 and 8, which everybody was asking about, and then talked her through where she could go vote. And then another guy told me that he had gone to his voting location near his house. I think he was 25, and he worked near Sherman Oaks, but he lived like Van Nuys or something, and they had not let him do his provisional ballot. So I was like, okay, well, if you're gonna go back there, call me before you do it so I can call the registrar and we can yada yada. But he actually ended up going and doing a provisional ballot in Sherman Oaks, and we talked him through it. And I did not have those kinds of conversations 2 years ago, and I joined our phone bankers then. And I also, when we worked on I guess that was the Prop 55, 56, 57 year also, we also didn't have those kind of conversations really on Prop 47. So I love that, and that we can just say to people like, actually, no, it's super easy. Or you can go the day before and go to Norwalk or go to.
Yeah, I will say, I remember 2 guys in particular that I engaged with who showed up and said, I want to vote, but I'm not a registered voter. But I thought, cool, you want to vote. Okay, so here's your reality. I can't let you vote here, but if you're interested in going to Van Nuys, that's the only spot where you can register and vote on the spot. And one guy said, you know what, I'm gonna drive out there. I'm gonna do that, right? It was huge. So I would love to know your thoughts too, again, sort of going back to the changes that we've experienced, and now the outlook's looking a little bit different, but I'm curious from your perspective, what impact will the changes that have happened in terms of who's in office and who isn't, what impact do you think that's going to play on social justice issues moving forward at the federal level? And I'd love to know specifically at the state level, and I'm thinking in particular about Gavin Newsom as our new governor. Jerry Brown had some strong positions and some weak positions on criminal justice reform. What can we expect to be similar or different with Gavin? So if you could kind of go broad and then maybe narrow, yeah.
Okay, sure. So on the federal level, in some ways, because we've had a state strategy for probably a decade now in our national network, I feel less able to say a lot about that. I think the place that we've most focused questions where where I think there are going to be some really helpful shifts is around immigration and funding of DHS. So, there was an effort last year to do I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's like the budget version of a discharge position, for those of you who know what that is. But they were trying to ram through a big increase in funding for DHS. And even with control of Republicans having control of the multiple branches there, it didn't happen, but it was very difficult to defeat. And I think now that the Democrats have the House, I'm hopeful that there's just going to be a lot more, it's a system of checks and balances, that there's just going to be a lot more checks in terms of the ongoing escalation of threat to immigrant communities. So that's the main thing that is coming up for me. Obviously, it also will mean that we'll have more opportunities to, put out in front our version of stories, because once you're proposing legislation as opposed to always on the defensive and trying to figure out how you're going to block things, we get to tell our stories more frequently. They get more airplay. And I should just say, for the record, LA Voice is a nonprofit 501c3. So the Katie Hill race work was not LA Voice, and we have people who have been Republicans and Democrats inside of our organization across the country, including on our national board. But the reality is the reality is the reality. So we work with who's going to work with us on what we want to do. We do have LA Voice Action, which is a C4, and that's how we did the stuff in the Katie Hill race. But yeah, so I think that's maybe all I feel really confident saying about the national level, other than just I'm really glad that we have some stoppage. And then I think it's going to be interesting to see how these new members of Congress approach organizing their own constituency, not just for 2020, but I think there are more and more people who've been running for office, both pre-Obama but also post-Obama, who are thinking about their position and community organizing in a more integrated way. And I'm interested to see what some of the candidates who clearly got elected because they did good organizing, how they bridge that locally. And we may not hear those stories, but how they're building power for the movement in the broader sense through their position is some of what I'm excited to see. So that's that. I think on the state level, we did a meeting with Gavin Newsom about a month before the election, with about 400 people. You had some people from All Saints there in the audience, so thanks to those of you who came. 400 folks with him out in San Gabriel Valley, and we asked him questions on our three big issues. So we had testimony from individuals who are directly impacted, as well as questions on criminal justice reform, on housing and homelessness, and also on immigration. I think the two things that were most significant to me that he said, and we're now scheduling a follow-up meeting with him, so he had agreed to meet with us within 30 days of winning the election. So we're working on that follow-up meeting now, which is exciting. Instead of with Jerry Brown, we had to rely on our founder, who's a Jesuit priest, knowing him from when they were in the novitiate together. So it's and it took us a few years to make that happen. So now we have a much more public, intentional relationship with the next governor of California. So one story he told that stuck out to me that is really important as we think about housing, which is he told a story about when his mother was undergoing chemotherapy. Because we asked him about renter protections, period. We knew all the stuff he'd said about building more housing, and that's all good. Of course, we agree with that, but a lot of people agree with that, and the renter stuff is a lot harder to win. So we focused our attention on the renter protections, and he talked about his mother being in chemo in an apartment when she got, quote-unquote, Ellised. Does anybody know what that is? It's when the owner of the building uses the Ellis Act which was passed around the same time as Costa-Hawkins, the thing we were trying to repeal with Prop 10, used the Ellis Act to sell their rent control apartment to someone who was going to convert it into condos. So she was evicted in the middle of her cancer treatment. The fact that he chose to tell that story with us not just was a smart political thing for him to do because he knew that would connect with our folks, but also told us something about what he was maybe going to be willing to do with us in the months ahead. So we have to repeal the Ellis Act or change it, and we have to repeal Costa-Hawkins or significantly change it. So yeah, let's clap for that. We have applause up here in the front. And then the last thing I'll say on this, the other thing that he said that was heartening to me was around criminal justice reform. So really three things. One is we would like to have someone who is formerly incarcerated in the prison system on the parole board, which has never happened. So that's one thing we're asking for, which it sounds like he's open to. We'll see. He didn't commit hard, but it's definitely part of the conversation. The other thing he said was he both praised the bail reform and, without us even suggesting it, he talked about that we didn't actually get all the reform that we needed, and gave acknowledgement to our concerns about how I'm glad it passed, and we want to make sure that the new system doesn't become unintentionally racialized as well. And he actually brought that up on his own, which we all gave him a huge applause for, and talked about going further with bail reform. And then lastly, he basically called Jerry Brown cheap when it came to moving money from reforms that we've passed, like Prop 47 and others, and actually capturing, Governor Brown has been in many ways an ally, as you said, but in other ways he has not really fully recognized the savings that we believe are there from some of the reforms that we've won together. And he basically said that he's going to be excited about increasing. Yeah, he basically said, I'm not going to be as cheap as Jerry. So I think that's a good sign, because we do need to move more money into prevention and reentry.
That's right. So I want for us to, we're running out of time quickly, and I want for us to talk a little bit about Prop 10, because you referred to it just a moment ago. What happened? What are your thoughts on what happened with this campaign?
Well, it was a record amount spent against us. $90 million, I think, at last count. $90 million. Yes, so Prop 10 would have repealed Costa-Hawkins, which would have allowed us to have more expansive rent controls across the state of California. Right now, short version is, the reason Isabel, who cares for my son Andres every afternoon and took care of him for a year before he started daycare, has had 5 rent increases and can't do anything about it, is because her building was built after 1978. And Costa-Hawkins limits what cities can do if they have old rent control measures. So LA City, there's like certain things they just can't do to strengthen rent control. So, so Prop 10. So we had a record amount spent against us, which if you're thinking about 2020, we need to be prepared for even more to be spent against us in our effort to pass the Schools and Communities First Act, which will close the corporate property tax loophole. And it's going to be an even bigger fight if we thought this one was. If we thought it was bad to see Villaraigosa getting paid to be on Spanish language channels telling people to vote no on 10, really, Antonio? Then I think we should just anticipate worse, because there's even more money at stake. This was actually a priority defeat for the entire, on national calls with national shareholder organizations like Blackstone and others who own tons of properties across California. This was a priority for them to defeat it. I also, so money is a huge factor. I also think that we started too late. So, we're now 2 years out for Schools and Communities First Act, and we've actually been talking about it with California Calls and other allies for 4 years. So it's not easy to describe some of these laws and why they really how they really impact us. So I think there's we got to get better at some of our communicating about this. And then some of our congregations also we had not started the conversation soon enough for landowners in their communities to basically to have enough space so that a congregation can make an endorsement if they had landowners in their communities, which was, I could be mad about that and say that's a super bummer, but the truth is, people own land in some of our congregations, and we just have to address that, period. And it doesn't mean we got to change the policy, but if we're not willing to have a difficult conversation about it, I can't blame other people for that. I have to say, well, what's LA Voice's responsibility in that? And I think each community has to look at that as well. So it was hard. Yeah, it was a bummer to lose.
It is a bummer. And you know what is also a bummer for me? When I think about $90 million and what $90 million could do for affordable housing opportunities. Yeah. I mean, to think that the opposition spent that amount of money and we could have really put that to good use, right? I mean, it's heartbreaking.
I know we're running out of time, but I think the other thing too is there's this perception that a lot of the people who own apartment buildings are like mom and dad, or like I own 3 buildings. And that is still really alive in people's imagination. But we had a whole bunch of people who own 1 or 2 buildings sign on as supporters of Prop 10. But that's not the story that's in voters' minds. The story in voters' minds is, oh, well, this is really going to hurt, somebody who's banking on this for their retirement.
Right. Yeah, that was the narrative that was pushed. And I'm not sure if I used this metaphor with you, but I felt all the time as I was watching these commercials in opposition to Prop 10 that the narrative was sort of saying, like that this aspirin pill, Prop 10, it doesn't cure cancer, and therefore it doesn't cure cancer, so then you don't want to believe in that pill, which was, they created this whole counter narrative about what Prop 10 wasn't going to do, when Prop 10 never said it was going to do those things, right? But that in the minds of voters, I know was significant. I know a few people who said, I actually voted no on Prop 10, was that a wrong decision? and they told me why, and it was based in this flippant narrative, yes. Well, hopefully we'll get another shot.
Yeah, and you can still pressure, like your city council can still do things. So we were, you know what I mean? Maybe they won't.
They won't. This one won't.
But they could, right?
Yeah.
In Inglewood,
that's
they
right.
could. In Baldwin Park, they could.
Yeah.
So I think that comes back to the question about our power.
We definitely can continue to push, but I'll be explicit and say I know some folks for whom housing is their justice issue, had a meeting with the mayor, and the mayor opened the meeting by saying, we're not talking about rent control. And they said, well, we're actually not here to talk about rent control. And he said, just for the record, we are not talking about rent. It's that level of resistance that I think that we have in our leadership in our own city. So, we will continue to press, and it's a pretty significant opposition. So maybe in the last minute, and then we have to go, what's next? And what next in particular for communities of faith? What can we expect to be invited into in the coming years?
I'm thinking about 2030. And my son's 3.5, and I'm thinking about 1.5 degrees. And I'm thinking about that we can't even get Pasadena City Council to put in rent control and Inglewood because the mayor says. Meanwhile, people are suffering. So I'm trying to think beyond the horizons I've normally looked at. And we just launched this clergy and faith leaders cohort called Deeper Roots. It's Deeper Roots. The subtitle is Spiritual Leadership in a Moment of Tumult. And I think the question is, what more can we offer that we're not offering because we're afraid we might not have enough? We're afraid maybe we don't have the resilience. We're afraid maybe we're not really sure we believe that God is going to give us what we need for the win. And I don't mean the win like the policy win. I mean like the world we want. So there's the issue work is going to continue. I'm going to ask the organization this year to look at how climate intersects with all of our issues and see if we can add it into our 5-year theory of change. But it's a really, thank you, yeah. It's a really crucial moment we're trying to reclaim what faith means in the public square. I was born in 1979, so I've never lived outside of the rise of the religious right. And I'm from Plainfield, Indiana, so I heard it growing up. I know I'm from the American Baptist Church, which while not, the Southern Baptist Convention, there's connections to the narratives that I grew up with. And part of the reason we rebranded our national network Faith in Action is because we're trying to say that we're not going to let somebody else say what faith is. We're going to claim it for ourselves and say that it means a multiracial interfaith movement that's going to build the kind of world where we can all thrive, we can all survive, and save our freaking planet.
Well, thanks, Zach, for your leadership. Thank you for all that you do, and your staff is phenomenal at LA Voice. And I want to say on behalf of all of us, and I'm sure you agree, that we want to be part of that work with you. And so this won't be the last time you hear from Zach, I'm sure. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Pray for us.